Hi, I'm Dave Mendlen. I'm the product planner for Visual Basic. And we're here today to talk about building scalable server-side applications, or what I call RAD for the server. Not RAD for the surfer, RAD for the server. So let's get started. Before we drill right into this, I'll be talking about and illustrating a lot of Visual Basic code and concepts because I'm the product planner for Visual Basic. But it's important to understand that this set of technologies that I'll be walking through also work with C# or any other language that's on top of our platform. And I mentioned we'll be doing demos. We have quite a bit of demos at the end of the presentation, and I'll be taking questions live. So if you have questions about this topic or about Visual Basic in general, I'll be happy to take those. So the problem: building middle-tier business objects requires a lot of code. And obviously, that's the middle tier is where customers focus most of their energies. That's where your business rules are. That's where your competitive advantage exists. So that's where you want to also focus scalability issues. You want to make sure that your application scale. That focus is on the middle tier. But it requires a lot of code. We need to make it a lot easier. Finding a server resource that exists on your corporate network, whether it be a message queue or a performance counter, an event log, or some other server-based resource, can be quite difficult. Once you've found one of these server resources that exists out there, programming against these objects can be very complex. You need to understand sometimes a very deep and complex object model, and a lot of times you have to know a lot more about the object than you care to. You have to be actually almost an MSMQ administrator to program against the object. So we need to simplify those server-based resources as well. Now, once you've built an application and you're starting to move it from your development machine into test, debugging an application, whether it be in your test environment or in production, can be rather difficult. And that's an area that we're focused on, is making it easier for developers to debug their applications once they've been moved into a test phase or into production phase. Now, you've got an application that exists out on your corporate network somewhere, or even on the World Wide Web, and you need to make some changes to the way the application works. Well, we have some technologies inside of Visual Studio that enable you to make modifications real-time to your application while they're running, so that if you need to change real-time connection to a database or a message queue, you can do that without having to open up your application, change the lines of code that are there, and then recompile and send it back through a test phase. So that's the problem that we're trying to tackle. So our vision: make it as easy to build fast, robust, scalable server-side applications as it is today to create client applications today. I think of this simply as RAD for the server. Not for the surfer, for the server. So the scenarios that we're trying to enable: first and foremost, we want to make the experience of creating a web service simply drag and drop. We want to make it easy to find these server-based resources, discovery of these server-based resources. You can go to a single place, a developer cockpit, where you can find these resources. And then once your application is in both test and debugging and production, we want to have tools that simplify that process of debugging your code and changing your code and deploying your code through that set of steps. So the design time innovations: what are we doing to enable this? First, the Server Explorer, which is a new tool window inside of Visual Studio that provides a way to find all the server-based resources that you're looking for, whether they be web services or message queues, performance counters, event logs, Exchange servers, whatever it is that you're looking for that exists on your network. You go here and you find the resource that you're looking for. And obviously the benefit here is that rather than having you as a developer recreate a resource that may already exist on your network, you can now find these things in an easier way. You don't have to run around from cubicle to cubicle asking if we have a message queue for customers, for example. And we want to be able to manage these resources within the development environment. So for example, in the Server Explorer, you have the ability to start and stop NT services. create and delete and rename message queues. These kinds of activities that you want to be able to do inside of Visual Studio are all there and are all core to the Server Explorer. We're also enabling drag and drop development of components and web services. And that's through a visual component designer. So rather than today, when you build middle-tier business objects, you write a lot of code. And with the component designer, developers can visually construct applications and components the way that you create a Windows application today. Today, there are over 3 million VB developers that know how to drag and drop from a toolbox onto a form and paint their application, setting properties, double-clicking to write their event logic. With the component designer, we take that same metaphor to the middle tier, to building business objects. We'll have a visual design surface to drag and drop objects onto, set properties, and then double-click to write code handlers behind these objects. So we're extending the notion of drag and drop and RAD, rapid application development, to building middle-tier business objects. RAD, rapid application development. RAD for web services. It's a 3-step process. You're going to drag and drop the server resources that you need from the Server Explorer to the component designer, and then you're going to set the properties that are required. You may have to write a little application code, and then simply compile your application, and Visual Studio will take care of publishing your web service to the website that you're using. So there's a lot of work that went on in those 3 simple steps. First of all, of course, the simplicity of drag and drop, creating a message queue could be tens or hundreds of lines of code, depending on what you're doing with that message queue. And that's simply drag and drop. Setting properties may also reduce the amount of code that you write. And then compilation, we'll actually compile the component locally as a DLL, and then publish that to a URL on a web server, so that anybody that has access to your web server can then access that web service. So one of the most important pieces of building distributed, scalable server-side applications is the ability to build asynchronous applications. And messaging using Microsoft Message Queue is a great way to do that. So what we've done is we've taken the technologies that you may have seen in Microsoft Message Queue 2.0 and extended them. And in fact, we've created what we'll call wrapper classes around those Microsoft Message Queue objects to simplify the process of interacting with them, so that in most cases you have simple methods and properties to deal with some of the most complex things that go on in terms of programming to Microsoft Message Queue. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Microsoft Message Queue, not only are you able to create messages that can span machines, but they can also span platforms using bridges to MQ series, for example. And with MSMQ, we can actually create messages that have not just text strings. We can also create objects or really any primitive or any custom payload and send that as a message through Microsoft Message Queue. And the nice thing about Message Queue is it works both connected and disconnected. I'm actually not connected to the internet right now or to my local network, and yet I can still queue up messages to my message queue. I also mentioned that our tools in the Server Explorer deal with administration. We want to make it easy for you to administer your applications in the development environment. And so you can, as I mentioned earlier, you can both create, delete, rename queues right from within Visual Studio, provided that you have the appropriate permissions. We don't override any of the permissions in the Server Explorer. If you don't have access to that server, then you won't have access to, natively, then you won't have access to it through the Visual Studio environment. So it's really easy to use Microsoft Message Queue with Visual Studio. And you can see in this simple example that we're going to send, we have 2 instances. In the top example, we're dimensioning MQ as a new message queue and passing in the queue name. And then it's a simple matter of just typing in mq.send and typing in the text that you want to send to your Microsoft Message Queue. So we've made really a one-step operation. You have to type in the mq.send part. If you want to interact with an object as opposed to a primitive, you can simply type in this case, customer.name equals John Smith, and we can actually send the customer object, and that works just the same way as a string. So you can see how simple it is how simple we've made interacting with Microsoft Message Queue. Not just sending messages, but also receiving messages. It's just exactly the opposite. Instead of a send method, we have a receive method. So in this case, we do an mq.receive. And what's beautiful about this is, of course, we're using Microsoft Visual Studio's IntelliSense technology, so that instead of having to actually remember whether you need to type in send or receive, you can simply pick it from a list. And that works, again, whether it's from a primitive or a string in this case, or an object. You simply select the receive method. There are a lot of server resources that exist on the corporate network, and here's a few of them we think are particularly interesting. Performance counters. One important point here for those of you that are programming in Visual Basic is you can create performance counters, and in fact it's 2 lines of code to create a performance counter, and I've created one and we'll use one in the demonstration here in a few moments. So you can use both custom performance counters that you create in Visual Basic or in C# or in C++, or you can use the system counters that already exist on your server. And once you've created a performance counter, one of the things that's very handy about this is there's an MMC snap-in, a Microsoft Management Console snap-in for the performance monitor, so that any performance counter that you create, a developer or even a manager can watch this monitor to see what's going on with your system. And so we'll see using a performance monitor so that a manager could watch to see how orders are processing through a system, for example. Now, if you have errors in your application, and sometimes we get those, you want to be able to read and write those things out to an event log. And so we have an NT event log that's part of the Visual Studio Server Explorer. You have access to, of course, the application, the system event logs that you'd expect, and you can create your own event logs and write them out there as well. And you can create those event logs from right within the Server Explorer. So as you get an error, you're probably going to want to write something out, whether it be to an application log or to a custom event log, and it's very, very simple to do that. Simply drag and drop. Now, one of the most difficult challenges that, one of the things that I've seen quite frequently when developers are building applications, especially these really big applications, these server-side business objects, is they wind up doing a lot of print statements. They're writing out what's going on every line of their application, so that when their application is deployed, they can set a switch at runtime at the command line, for example, that where these messages get spit out, so that you as a developer can kind of debug in production what's happening to your application. And that obviously increases the amount of code that you've got in your application, makes it less maintainable, and is really kind of a painful way to debug your application. So we've got some built-in tracing that's core part of the platform and our framework that you essentially will turn on. And there are various levels of tracing, everything from 0, the default, all the way up to 3. Now, at runtime, you'll turn on the tracing to the level that you want to see. And I think 3 is the most comprehensive set of information that's happening in your application. It'll emit all this stuff out to a format that you want, whether it be to a file or to a console, so that you can see what's happening to your component or your application as it's running. And that's built right into the framework, so that you don't have to bolt on a lot of this excess code and the infrastructure that surrounds tracing. Now, when you're working on building middle-tier business objects, traditionally Microsoft, we think about building application components that run right now. But if you've ever worked in large applications that run on the mainframe, for example, they have things, they need to schedule applications, and you're probably already building applications that require components to be scheduled to wake up at a predetermined time. So that's a key scenario that we've heard again and again from our customers, is scheduling. And the way that we're dealing with that, we have a number of technologies inside of Visual Studio that simplify the process of building these scheduled business objects. The first is there's actually a scheduled component, which is a very, very flexible recurrence pattern. You can decide how often you want your particular component, your business object, to wake up, for lack of a better word. It can be calendar-based. You can say every third Tuesday. It can be you can say every third Tuesday, but this Tuesday and next Tuesday. You can say every April 15th. It's probably the most flexible scheduling component I've ever seen. I haven't found a scenario that isn't yet supported with the scheduling component. Having done a lot of JCL mainframe coding that required doing lots of very complex scheduling aspects, this component should satisfy your most heinous needs. In terms of directory watcher, a lot of applications require watching what's happening in your file system to see what's going on when, a lot of times if a file gets FTP'd to a particular location, your application needs to wake up and do something with that file. And so we have this directory watcher component that can respond to a number of different events that may occur. One of the things that may happen is you may rename a file, and you can respond to that event. You can respond to the event where where a file is placed into a directory, where a directory is created, where a file is deleted, where a directory is deleted. Virtually anything that's going to happen in the file system, you can track that, identify that, and respond to that event with the directory watcher component. Now, we've had timers in the past with Visual Basic and with Visual C++. We've got a new asynchronous timer that is a much more efficient timer than you may have seen in the past. We're using our thread pooling technology. It doesn't use a message pump, so you're not going to see a lot of blocking. We think this is a very efficient timer. Now, once you've built an application, you need to get it staged, whether it be from development to test or from test to string test. We don't expect that the deployment technologies that are part of Visual Studio replace the deployment technologies that your customers are already using. If they're using SMS or some other technology, they're probably going to continue to use that in production. These deployment technologies are really to enable you to facilitate moving applications and application components from from development to, say, unit test to, say, string test. That's the kind of deployment that we're talking about here. And there are some installer technologies that are built right into Visual Studio and built right into the frameworks. And the first is that we can have server resources. If you build an application that takes advantage of, say, a message queue or a performance counter or an event log, well, that application requires that server resource enabled for your application to run. You may need to have an event log named event log 1. You may need to have a message queue named accounts receivable. You may need to have a performance counter that tracks the number of orders processed. So all of these things are requirements for your application to run. So as you move from development to say unit test, you're going to need to ensure that those components exist. And the custom installers do that for you. You simply will create your deployment application, and then when you publish and when you execute that deployment application, these custom installers will execute, checking to see whether you already have those message queues with those names, those event logs with those names, those performance counters with those names, and if they don't exist, they will create them for you. You may, in fact, need to have messages pre-filled in your message queue, for example. That can also occur as part of the custom installation process. You can also, this is a very flexible custom installer technology. There may be a specific set of actions that you want to occur that we're just not aware of. There may be some specific technologies that aren't even part of Microsoft's universe that you need to ensure occur as you move from development to, say, unit test. And so you can create your own user custom installer that executes when the rest of these custom installers execute, and you can decide when and how those custom installers execute, if at all. Now, one of the most interesting and exciting pieces of our deployment strategy is this notion of dynamic properties. Developers can create an application, and one of the biggest challenges is that your application functionality may need to change when the application is deployed. Perhaps the business rule changes. You may have an application, an expense reporting application, where the limit for approving expenses is $1,000. And later on, we find that the approval rate jumps from $1,000 to $1,500 per person as a manager. Well, rather than having to go back and modify your business rules to support that, dynamic properties allow you as a developer to bind anything that exists in the IDE to an external source. And in the example that I'll show, we'll be working with an XML file. So that as your application changes over time, you'll be able to modify that without having to go through the process of opening the development environment, opening your project, making the business rule change, recompiling, and going through the QA process. You can actually change application functionality real time. So if, for example, a message queue needs to change because one server is going down and you need to bring up another server, you can make that modification through dynamic properties. If you need to change your database connections as you move from phase to phase, of your life cycle. That's another example where a dynamic property might be very handy. So the key here is that we're trying to simplify the process of, at runtime, changing the way your application executes without having to recompile your business rules. So it's now time to execute a fairly complex end-to-end system. We're going to build an online order entry system, and we're going to be showing all of the features that we've just talked about, and we'll also be highlighting web forms, web services, and the new language features of Visual Basic. So the scenario we're going to walk through is creating an incoming orders application, an online order entry application. So what's going to happen is we're going to get an incoming order. It's going to come in via a web service. We're going to take that order and place it in a Microsoft message queue. We're then going to fan that message out to other message queues. And in the process of doing this, we want to make sure that we're doing lots of other things here as well. Obviously, we want to monitor our incoming message queues. We want to track performance counters. And one of the performance counters that we'll add in this application is tracking the number of orders placed so that your manager can see how well your website is doing, whether we're doing well or not. As there are errors that come in, we want to write those errors out to the event log. And we want to make sure that the application can be debugged remotely, so you can trace your application remotely. And finally, we want to be able to administer the application after it's been deployed, so that we can change the way the application behaves while it's in production. So let's take a look at the architecture of the application, and then we'll jump right into building it step by step. We'll have an online market florist web application. And when we make the request for an order, we're going to be making it to a web service. And that web service is going to talk to, first, a performance counter that increments once we place an order. We want to make sure we track the number of orders that have been placed. We also want to write out any errors to the event log. We want to fan out our order to message queues. So we're going to write out to an inventory message queue. We want to make sure that as the order comes in, somebody can look at a pick list and pull these things off the shelves. We also want to make sure that accounts receivable is notified so we get paid for our order. And we'll also be working with the backup queue so that after the application has been built, we'll change the behavior of it so that we can reroute one of the message queues to another queue, this backup queue. So that's the application we're going to try to build right here live. So let's get into it. So first, let's take a look at the first application. The scenario that we're walking through is there are two companies here. There's the Market Florist website, who is a consumer of a web service, and there's a provider of a web service, and that's the wine seller. The wine seller is an e-commerce wine seller. They sell red wines and white wines, and they also have the notion of Wine of the Month Club. Now, this application has been built with web forms. You may see this running in the Visual Studio IDE. You can see one of our web forms is open. So the wine seller is going to take the Wine of the Month Club, and they want to make that a service that's provided to anybody out on the web that wants to use it. Now, obviously, the benefit to the wine seller is that they'll get more revenue. Anybody that calls the wine seller service is placing an order for wine. They'll make more money. Now, anybody that uses the wine seller Wine of the Month Club web service will get benefit as well, because they'll have a much richer experience, and they'll probably take a little bit off the top. They'll add a little money to the transaction so that they make some money in calling the Wine of the Month Club. So here is the website for the wine seller, and here is the Wine of the Month Club. Here's the Wine of the Month Club page, and this is the functionality that we're going to expose out as a web service. So going back into the shared Visual Studio integrated development environment, we talked about RAD for the server, and the two key characteristics of RAD for the server. First is the Server Explorer, and second is the Component Designer. So let's take a look at the Server Explorer. I have it docked to the toolbox, and let's try that again. Now I have it docked to the toolbox, and I'll expand it out, and you can see the list of server-based resources that exist there. Everything from event logs to performance counters. You can start and stop loaded modules, start and stop NT services. We'll walk through this in just a moment. We also have access to the visual database tools that you may have used in Visual InterDev, in Visual Basic, or the other Visual Studio tools in Visual Studio 6 are now shared in the Server Explorer. So that's the place that you should look to find your visual database tools, under the Data Connections node of the Server Explorer. So what I'm going to do now is, now that we've got the Server Explorer opened, let's create a new component and paint our middle tier business objects using RAD for the server. I'll right-click and select Add, Component. I've got a lot of things loaded, so this may take a little bit. And here is the Server Explorer. What we're going to do is we're going to drag and drop from the Server Explorer to the Component Designer. And you can see that there's actually even a little tip, so that if you're a developer and you don't understand how to use this component, you can simply click on that hyperlink and it will bring up the Server Explorer for you. So the first thing we want to use is an event log. If there are errors, I want to write out those errors to an event log. And I'm going to use the application event log. So I'll simply drag and drop that to our component. And I'm done. I've essentially wired up my event log. I now want to use a performance counter. And I mentioned the fact that you can build these things in Visual Basic now. We should make this a little larger. You can also build these in C# or in C++. So here is the wine cellar. And I've created a performance counter that tracks every order that gets created. So we've got an orders processed performance counter. And I'll simply drag and drop that into my design surface. And rather than having to write a lot of code to have things work the way I want, I can simply set properties. And so I'll scroll down, and I want to change the instance name of my performance counter. I'll simply select that and make a couple of other modifications. And I have now connected to a performance counter. Now, just what I've just done is, as you can imagine, a lot of code, but I'm simply dragging and dropping. It's going to simplify the process of creating these distributed applications greatly. Now I want to use a message queue. I want to make sure that I've got guaranteed message delivery, and I want to make sure that I've got asynchronous cross-platform messaging. So message queue is the way I'm going to go. I'm going to use the accounts receivable message queue. And I'm also going to use the inventory pick list message queue. And again, I'm just simply dragging and dropping onto my design surface. Well, I've essentially done everything I need to do. I need to write a little code to connect these objects together. So I'll simply right-click on the design surface and select View Code. And let me collapse the Server Explorer, and we'll scroll down to the bottom. Now, one of the things that you may have seen in previous demonstrations are people dragging things from the toolbox onto a code window, or even to HTML. That's one of the new features of Visual Studios. We have a shared toolbox that lets you stash snippets of code, whether they be HTML, script, or code. In our case, I've got a snippet of code that's a function that's called Order Wine Club. It's really rather simple. And in what I think is about 6 or 7 lines of code, I have built an application that talks to an event log, a performance to 2 event logs. I'm sorry, 1 event log, a performance counter, and we'll also write a connection to 2 message queues. So let's look at this really quickly. I'm using the on-air go-to syntax. I should have used try catch, but I whipped this out pretty quickly. You're in the future obviously going to want to prefer to use try catch. But in this case, I'm sending a message to a message queue, message queue1.send, and I'll type in I want to give you a sense for how simple it is to interact with these server-based objects. I talked about the fact that we've created wrappers around these these server objects to make it easier for you to develop against them. So if I were to type in message queue2 dot, it gives me a list of all of the things that I can do against this object, for instance, send or receive. And so it's really rather simple to just pick the thing you want to do, send, and I want to send an order. So in these 6 or 7 lines of code, I have just built a middle tier business object that's scalable, that talks performance counters, event logs, and message queues. Very, very simple to build. Now, I've built a component. I've built a business component. But if I want to make my application, my component, expose as a web service, I need to do something. And in the case of Visual Basic, you may have seen demonstrations by me where I've typed in dim web public. Don't get too used to that syntax. That's a hack. It's a hint to the compiler that we want to expose every function in the component as a web service. Now, for the builds, for the demonstrations that we've done publicly, it's fine, but obviously not every customer wants to expose every function as a web service. What we'll likely have is something at the function level. Just for your information, we'll probably have something like this, where you'll type in web public function or web public sub, as opposed to this kind of dim web public, which doesn't really mean a lot. But just by typing in dim web public, I have told the compiler that I want to expose this as a web service. And now when I select build, it will automatically compile this component locally, and it knows this is, I'm actually using a web project. If I go to the Solution Explorer, you'll see that we're actually pointing at a web server, my localhost, the wine cellar website. So it's automatically created this component, compiled it, published the DLL to my web server, and it's also created an XML file that you may hear something called SDL, or Service Description Language. That XML file describes the public interfaces of my component. So you'll see in XML, in fairly human-readable form, basically kind of what an IDL is. You'll see public function, the name of the function, and the parameters that need to get passed in and what gets passed out, so that any developer on any platform can call this web service because they're interacting with an XML file. They're going to make a request through XML to a function. It's going to execute locally on that machine, and then it will return back to us pure XML. And so all of that, as you can see, we just graphically, in a rad way, created a web service that talks to message queues, performance counters, and event logs. And it's very easy to do. So now that we've created a web service and we've exposed it out on a website in a very easy way, now we want to use it. So let's go over and take a look at the Market Florist website. Here it is in the Visual Studio integrated development environment. And you can see that it's an e-commerce florist shop, so you can buy flowers on the web. Now, they want to extend their business. When we talk to customers about web services, we talk about something called sticky eyeballs. You want customers to come to your site, and you never want them to leave, right? You want to have sticky eyeballs. You want them to always stay at your site, never leave, never go to a competitor's site, never go to anybody else's site. You want to have the comprehensive user experience for a customer. And so you want to extend the set of services that you as a company provide, and the way that you can do that is through web services. So Market Florist can now sell Wine of the Month without having to do anything other than make a web service call to their site. And now they can provide a more comprehensive offering so that you can buy both flowers and wine from the same site. So let's take a look at how you could use the web service that's already been created. Now, the way that you'll do that is by going to the Server Explorer. And let me expand this out so we can see better. There are a lot of nodes under the Server Explorer. And one of the most interesting ones is, let's see if we can find it here, Web Methods. So I'll expand this out. And what you're doing is I'm pointing at a particular server, whether it be on the internet or on your local network, and it's going to look at the discovery services that are available on that server to let us know what web services exist and that I have access to. And so here are the list of web services that exist and that I have access to. And now I can simply cruise through these things. And the one that we just created used a component called Component 1, and it was on the Wine Cellar website. So if I expand this out, you can see here's the Order Wine Club function that we just created. So if I want to use a web service, I simply pick it from the Server Explorer, right-click, and select Add to my project. Now, you should understand that although in this case I'm using Windows 2000, I'm connecting to a Windows 2000 server, you'll be able to add any web service to your project simply by following the same set of steps. So I've added the Wine Cellar web service to my project, and now I need to write a little code to provide a user interface for our customers so they can order the Wine of the Month Club. So I've got another page where it's a web form. All these pages that we keep seeing are web forms. And Dan mentioned earlier the benefits of web forms. Obviously, they let you create web applications the same way that VB developers create Windows applications. Exactly the same way. So drag and drop elements from the toolbox onto a web form, set properties, double-click to get to the event handler, write your code, press F5, and your application will run. In this case, running in the context of a browser. So the benefits here, obviously, is we've got server-side. The code that executes runs on the server, and it can be either Visual Basic code or C# code. It's the full language, not script. So you get the benefits of the full language, and it's compiled running on the server. And the user interface can run on any browser on any platform. You can target a particular browser platform just by setting a property of the web form. So let's construct. We've already started constructing this web form. I'm going to show you kind of completing it. If I go to the toolbox, there are a number of web form controls that will ship in the product, and one of them is called a data list. A data list is kind of a grid on steroids for the web. It lets you not only have pictures and text, but it does it. You can create a very, very flexible grid, and you'll see what I mean here in a second. So I just simply drag and drop that to my web form. We've got a very pretty user interface. Using pictures, using text, using style sheets, you can create a very elegant user interface. So as I mentioned, if you want to program a web form, it's exactly the same way you interact with a VB form today. You simply pick the objects you want to work with and then double-click to write code. And so in this case, we're looking at the on-click event for the data list. And now I can simply write VB code. I'm actually working on two separate files. And if you look at the development environment, you'll see that we've got the specials.cls file up here. And over here, if I scroll over a little bit, I guess I can't, is the specials.aspx file, which is the HTML file. Essentially, the ASPX file is purely HTML. And there's a little GUI at the top. There's a little tag at the top that connects this HTML file to this class file, so that when events get fired, they get fired in this file. So now I'm going to write a little code. I'm typing in dim my cart as new my cart. I'm actually going to create a new instance of a shopping cart. And in order to program against a shopping cart, I'll simply select the add to cart method. And this is exactly the way you program against a web service. You'll create a new instance of your shopping cart or any web service, and then pick properties or methods of those objects. Because Visual Studio is interrogating the XML, that SDL file that we talked about earlier, we know what the names of all of your functions are and the name of all of your objects. So we can provide full IntelliSense against web services, even if they're programmed on Unix on a Unix machine written in other programming languages. You'll still get a rich programming experience, as you see here. So calling into the add to cart method, I need to pick, as you can see, it's prompting me for each of the parameters. So in this case, it's asking me for what the SKU is, and I'll just type in 2003, and the SKU is red wine, and the price is $199.23. So you can see decimal is the first class data type here. So now that I've got this created, I'm essentially done. But what I want to do now, I've created an instance I've connected to my web service that I've created using RAD for the server, and I've hooked it up to my code so that I can order this wine. But I've only shown you how to create and consume a web service on a Windows platform. What if you wanted to call a web service that was running in Unix using Java on Corba objects? Well, actually, I have an example of that. I can't show that here, but we did show this at TechEd, and I've replicated the exact server. I replicated that website onto my machine, so you can see the experience. It's exactly the same process. So one of the other web services that we showed at TechEd was, as I mentioned, a Java component that was written on Unix for Corba, and the service was actually called Wingtip Toys. And here it is. Here's the website. And so if you wanted to call into Wingtip Toys as a web service, they've exposed their Corba Java components as a web service. So for us, we would again, of course, go back to the Server Explorer. We'd find the Wingtip Toys web service, and I'll just pick it from the list and add it to my project. And now I'm connected to a Java Corba object that I can program against in a rich way. Now, because you've seen me author up a web form and you've seen me program against web services, I'm not going to show you that. We've already kind of pre-wired the code in to connect to that web service and the user interface for Wingtip Toys. So now let's go ahead and run the application, and I'll cross my fingers that it's ready to go. And what we'll do is we'll actually bring up a couple of administrative tools so you can see that the application is flowing through the proper administrative resources. We'll look at the performance counter to make sure that orders are flowing through. And we'll take a look at the message queue to make sure that the messages are being delivered to the appropriate message queues. So here is our website. And first, let's pick Springtime Bouquet. And let's pick a teddy bear. And that's from Wingtip Toys. And now let's also pick a Wine of the Month Club, and I'll pick red wine. And now we can check out. I'll go to the shopping cart page, and let's take a look at our order so far. We've got our bouquet, our teddy bear, our Wine of the Month. We're ready to place the order. So what I'll do now is I'll actually bring up the performance counter and the message queue MMC snap-in so we can take a look at the application as it runs. So let me resize my screen a little bit here. So down here is our website, and what I'll do is I'll start placing orders, and as I do, you'll notice the performance counter that's now currently at 0 will increase, and I'll refresh my message queue periodically to see that orders are flowing through the message queues. So let's try it. So our first order is placed. Second order, third order, and we have our cardiogram going fine over here. It looks like the patient is gonna make it. Let's refresh and see whether or not our messages are flowing through. So we've got 5 messages flowing through the accounts receivable message queue, 5 to the inventory message queue, and our performance counter is updating. Our application is working perfectly. But we want to change the application. Now that it's working exactly the way we want it to, we want to change the way that it behaves. So one of the ways that you might do that is through dynamic properties. And so what I'll do now is I'll leave this app running, and we'll minimize these tools, and we'll go back to the web service that makes this all work, the wine cellar web service, and we'll change the behavior of the application using dynamic properties. So I'll go back to the component designer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new component to the component designer, and that component is currently called XML Setting Store, but we think that will probably change. So I'll drop this object onto our design surface, and again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind properties of the IDE externally to an XML file. I think I have too many things running right now. All right, I'll go into the property window of the XML Setting Store, and I'll type in a path. So this is actually asking me where do you want to store this XML file? And I'll go ahead and put it on the root of my hard drive and call it florist.txt. Although it's actually going to create an XML file for me. In fact, it just did when I hit enter. So if I type in detect store changes, what this property says is, do I want to change the application real time as the application is running? And I'll set that to true. So now that I've done that, what I'll do is I'll bind the message queue path to that XML setting store. And so you'll see that there's a new control on our properties window, this one here called settings. And when I click on it, I can now bind the path of the message queue to our XML setting store component. And I want to store it in a key called message queue1.path. So essentially I've bound this message queue property to an external file. And now I'll do the same thing for the message queue 2. So I need to do a little fix-up code because this component needs one little snippet of code that you won't need when your application is, when this is done, this is kind of a hack, but for now we need it, which forces the path of the property into the XML file when you call the function. So I'll go ahead and save the component, or in this case it's a web service, and I'll build it. And again, one of the things you'll notice is that we're automatically compiling the component and publishing to our web service. We're not having to start and stop our web server. Whether you make modifications to your web forms or to your web services, you don't have to bounce your server anymore. Automatically, that is handled for you. We'll automatically put the most recent version of a web service or a web form, have that run on your IIS server automatically. So we're done. So let's go ahead and modify the behavior of our application. Let's take a look at the file that got created. It's c:/florist.txt, and here's the XML file that got created. And so what I'll do is we have this inventory pick list is one of the messages that, or one of the message queues that was showing up in our list. I'll change that to our backup queue, and I'll save it. And so now what I've just done is I've changed the way this application works. I don't need to do anything else other than go back and place another order. And if all goes according to plan, now instead of messages flowing to our inventory pick list message queue, they will flow to our backup queue. Let's refresh, and this is when everybody stands up and applauds. I can't hear you, but I assure you that I know that you're applauding out there. So, so as you can see, what we've just done, and I think in a very graphical way, is really enabled RAD for the server. Drag and drop creation of web services, simplified discovery of server-based resources. You can literally just drag and drop from the Server Explorer onto a component, set properties, write very minimal amounts of code. What we just saw, that application you just saw, I've written in VB6, and it was close to 700 lines of code. And now with the application that you just saw, I mean, it was 6, and that's also now a web service that runs message queues, performance counters, event logs. It's a phenomenal set of technologies. It's really easy to do this stuff. Whether you're a VB developer or a C# developer, you're going to find that RAD for the server is going to make your life a lot easier as you build these middle-tier business objects that need to scale. And clearly, one of the key parts here is that you can change your application's functionality after it's been deployed using dynamic properties. So RAD for the server is really pretty cool. So I'll take questions now.
Okay. One of the first questions, what mechanism does the Server Explorer use to discover the available services? How could it automatically know about all SDL on a given server?
So there's actually a set of technologies that Microsoft hasn't talked about publicly yet, and its code name is Disco, and Disco stands for Discovery Services. That is an XML-based technology that helps you find web services that exist on a particular web server. You'll be hearing more about it. We have made SDL somewhat public to people. We haven't been very forthcoming about Disco yet, but you'll be hearing more about it here shortly.
Okay, great. Second question. Can you extend the web form designer to use Photoshop, Premiere, and other things?
So the cool thing about web forms, I think one of the most important parts about web forms is that developers are generally not very good UI people. And so what winds up happening is we'll create a web form, and it'll be, probably look like a Battleship Gray VB form typically, right? We are not very good at that. So the nice thing about web forms is you can cleanly separate out the HTML from the code. So you can crank away on the application, on the code part of your application. You can hand off the HTML to anybody else, and they can just hand you an HTML file that they've already built, and then you can wire it to your code, your class file. whether it be in C# or in VB. So yeah, so the answer is you can use Photoshop or really any tool, create it the way you always create HTML the way you always have, and then connect that to your class file directly.
Okay. Third question. Can you change the server you're exploring?
Yeah, in fact, you right-click on the Server Explorer and select Add Server, and you can point it at any server that exists, whether it be a worldwide. You can actually type in an URL, www. Or you can type in an internal server name. So, and the other thing that's kind of nice about the Server Explorer is you can save views. So that if you have a design stage where you're working against these set of servers and these set of message queues and these set of databases, for example, you can say Save View. It's one of the menu options on the Server Explorer. And so that can be saved with design. And then you can go to unit test, and that may be pointing at a different set of resources. And you can restore and save any of these views.
Okay, this is a documentation question. What is going to be available in terms of documentation of C# and the tools being discussed today? And as a follow-up, will we see these by the PDC? So what's available from your user ed?
So user education, they are busily working on trying to put together documentation for all Visual Studio, Visual Basic, C#, etc. And our current goal is to try to get a stable build by PDC. We don't know whether or not that's going to happen. We're doing our best to make that happen, and if we do, the minute that we have good stable bits, of course, we'll make those available through Eric to you folks. But right now, we're working as hard as we can to see if we can get a build that will be stable enough that we want to give to customers.
Okay. Next question, and I know this is a popular question among the MSMQ community. Is tracing done through queues?
No, tracing is not done through queues. Tracing is actually built into the framework, and it's at a much more atomic level than through queues. Although you can certainly use queues to do tracing. You could certainly write things out to queues as part of the. It's a fairly extensible framework, so that if you wanted to send your trace output to a message queue, you could do that.
Okay. Will the Server Explorer, and you might have answered this already, will the Server Explorer allow a view of all web services in the enterprise, or just server by server?
So the question is, the Server Explorer, will it point at the entire enterprise or server by server? So the Server Explorer is actually currently designed to target you look at a particular server, you point it at any server, and it'll give you all the resources at that server. We are looking at discovery mechanisms that are more broad than that. And we don't think that they'll necessarily be part of the Server Explorer. There may be another feature in the IDE that we're looking at for giving you a set of exposed services on a more broad scale, but probably not as part of the Server Explorer.
Okay, next we have about three questions. When the ASPX and web services code is compiled, is it compiled into some sort of template like ASP is coded in IIS, or is it compiled into machine language? Right.
It's actually compiled into intermediate language. It executes intermediate language. So I don't understand the template question. I don't understand what you mean by that.
Just I can repeat it one more time.
No,
if
it's
not,
okay.
we can move on.
Okay, we'll move on.
Okay.
So the answer, hopefully the answer is the one you're looking for, which is the code is actually converts itself into IL, intermediate language. It's not really human readable, so you probably wouldn't want to go in and hack on it. I'm not even sure that you can, but that's the answer. It compiles to IL.
And here's the inevitable security question. With web services seemingly being so accessible, how will security in web services be handled? And perhaps this is open versus closed and those issues.
Open versus closed?
Rod?
Okay, so web services, there's a simple answer and there's a more complex answer. I'll give you the simple answer first, which is obviously the way that web services work is that you're going to want to expose out the functions that you want people to have access to, and you're going to, you're obviously not going to expose internal functions that you don't want people to have access to. Now, the other thing you should understand is that web services use native internet protocol, so that everything that applies to building secure websites also applies to building secure web services. So all of those other security technologies that you know and love apply to creating web services as well. So you can use those same same technologies. However, we're also investigating long-term being before we ship, obviously, some more infrastructure surrounding security. I don't have more details to give you at this point, but it's certainly key. Now, obviously, we have a very secure, using internet security standards, you have a very secure web service today just using today's internet standards. But we think we can make it easier for developers so that you as a developer can give access to a particular partner by potentially using keys or some other technology. We haven't fleshed out exactly how that all works yet, but that's something that's on the slate to figure out once we get an alpha out, hopefully soon. So it is, you have a very secure mechanism with web services to date, and we're going to try to make it even easier to take advantage of the security mechanisms that are on the internet as we move forward.
Okay, great. And I think we have 2 remaining questions.
I'm happy to take them.
Okay. Which net protocols will the web services support?
You mean HTTP? Are we talking about like HTTP and HTTPS, for example?
Correct.
Yeah. So
TCP, FTP.
So web services use HTTP. So you can use HTTPS as an example. You can't use FTP and obviously TCP/IP is underneath HTTP and HTTPS. So I hope I'm answering the question.
So no plans for FTP at this point?
No, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about what a web service is to make it to FTP. You could actually use FTP as part of a web service, but as an entry point, it doesn't make a lot of sense that we've been able to figure out yet.
Okay, and our last question, and then we'll let you go. Will there be an SP for VB6 that includes the web services SDK, for example, SOAP?
So you have 2 questions. You actually have 2 questions there, or I have 2 answers. One of them is there going to be an service pack? And I don't know whether it's out yet, but we just finished the latest service pack. If it isn't already out there, it'll be available very, very soon, with a lot of fixes for VB, VC, etc. Now, the second question is the SOAP toolkit is not included as part of the service pack, and there's a couple reasons for that. Not the least of which being that we've actually done some research with our customers and focus groups, talking to them about what they want to see in a service pack. And we've heard pretty loud and clear that they don't want features in a service pack. They want to just see fixes in a service pack. It makes it easier for their management team and for their development team to figure out when to apply patches. They don't want to incorporate new features. They want to make sure they're just fixing what's already there. So we try to separate out new features as much as we can from service packs. So the answer to SOAP Toolkit is that SOAP Toolkit is now available on MSDN, and all developers have access to it just by going up to the MSDN website. And it's a very easy process to create web services using VB6, using the SOAP Toolkit. It's not as rich an experience. You don't get things like the Server Explorer or the ability to have IntelliSense against your method calls, but you get a sense for how to create web services today, and it's the way that it's what you're going to want to point your customers at until we have a very stable beta, which will probably be in the late fall. So from now until at least then, we recommend if developers and customers want to get started with web services, get them a copy of the SOAP Toolkit off of MSDN, give them a copy of VB, and help them figure out how to do it. It's really easy. You're essentially going to create COM objects and run them through a wizard, and the wizard will expose out the SDL file, the service description language file, the XML file, that explains how to call that component. And once you've done that, you publish that to your web server, and you're done. So anybody can call that web service. So we expect in the very short term that there'll be a lot of web services that exist for you to both consume and for you. Now there's an opportunity for you to create web services out on the World Wide Web.
And perhaps you might want to take the opportunity to mention any NDA issues with the field.
So the RAD for the server features were actually shown at TechEd. The Component Designer and the Server Explorer were shown at TechEd. There are white papers. I use the term white paper loosely because they were written by marketing people, but they're white papers out on the Microsoft website on msdn.microsoft.com/vstudio/nextgen, and I'll have Eric put this up on the chat and send it out via email so you can find this location. But it's a great place to send your customers and for you to keep track of what's going on, what's been publicly disclosed. We have streaming video of the Bill Gates keynote where the RAD for the server features were explained. We have Steve Ballmer streaming video of web forms, web services, and the language innovations. And we've got white papers on C++ on attributes, on web forms, web services, and RAD for the server. So there's a lot of technical content as well as some marketing content that may be valuable to you as well. So that's the place to go, msdn.microsoft.com/vstudio/nextgen as a place to find out all the things that are going on as it relates to the VS7.
Okay, and I guess that concludes it, and we will have the final session starting in 1/2 hour at 4 o'clock.
Thank you.